All right, this is part 3 of lesson 8.2. So this is our last page here. So now we're going to look at conditional relative frequency. And what that means is it describes what portion of the group with a given characteristic also has another characteristic. So describes what portion of a group has a characteristic of another group. So for example, in the last example, how many boys like apple or how many girls like oranges? So let's use that previous example and find the conditional relative frequency that a person in the survey prefers apples, given that the person is a girl. So if I go back to our data, we see here there were 40 girls and 16 of them prefer apples. So we know we've got the number of people who prefer apples divided by the number of them that are girls. So that's going to give us 16 girls out of the 40 preferred apples. That's 40%. So 40% of the girls preferred apples. Find the conditional relative frequency of the person in the survey prefers an orange, given that the student is a boy. Well, there were 52 boys in the survey, and 14 of them preferred oranges. So that means we've got about 26.9% of the boys preferred oranges, okay, or about 27%. All right, so now let's try to find possible associations or patterns in the data. So we'll go back to our survey in the beginning about the preference on sports. Identify the percent of all students surveyed who are boys. Again, if we go back to our survey here, we can see there were 14 boys, 18 girls. Okay, so we said, what percent are boys? So total, there were 32 kids in the class, 14 of them are boys. So that equals 43.75% are boys. Determine each conditional relative frequency. So basketball. So, what's the number of boys that prefer basketball compared to the total that prefer basketball? So there were 11 boys who preferred basketball out of the 23 people who preferred basketball. Gives us 47.8%. Soccer. Boys who prefer soccer was 2 boys prefer soccer out of the 4 people that prefer soccer. So 50% of the people that prefer soccer are boys. Volleyball was only 1 in 5, which is 20%. Okay? So we want to know how many boys prefer basketball, given the total people who prefer basketball. Okay? We can see those different amounts. So again, this is boys who prefer those things. Okay? And then down here it says, interpret the results by comparing each conditional relative frequency to the percent of all students surveyed who were boys. Okay? So if we're looking at, and this is where we start looking for patterns. We're talking about basketball. Okay? So we see basketball, 47.8% of the boys preferred basketball, so 47.8%. but the group as a whole was 43.75%. So that means this is greater than. So that means we can kind of assume that overall the boys prefer basketball a little bit more than the girls. Okay, so the trend, the pattern we would see is boys more likely to play basketball. Okay, if we were to go, let's look at just volleyball though, and we can do this with soccer too. If we look at volleyball, 20% of the boys preferred volleyball versus 43.75% of the total group preferring volleyball. So 20% is less than. So that means the boys are less likely to play. And then you could inquire from that. You can kind of come to the conclusion, well, the boys are less likely to play volleyball, whereas girls are perhaps more likely to play. But even then, that can be skewed because if we look at the numbers of students, regardless of gender, who picked volleyball over the other two was much less. So those are things we have to look for. But either way, we can start looking for patterns in the data and see, like, are there preferences? Are there behaviors that we notice that maybe one group falls more towards than another. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to be the case, but that's at least what we can gather from the data that we have.